hair. Adam has very nice hair. I'm not even sure what else to say. So you also have about 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'll come up and the violating the personal space is getting a little old, so I'll ask people just to throw shmoo balls at you as we get closer. But it looks like this will be a little more touchy-feely than the last couple.
A little bit less technical, yeah.
A little bit less tactical. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I encourage all speakers, the one speaking tonight and later, to please repeat the questions from the audience. Ted's running around with a microphone trying to get a microphone into people's hands, but it's kind of hard to sprint all the way across here. So again, I need you as the jury of the audience to, if they don't repeat the question, huck stuff at them and keep them honest on that. So we'll start with you. All right, thanks, Adam.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm Adam Shostack, and I'm here to explain why security breaches are good for you. And because I have a good solid 20 minutes, I'd like to start with something that's apparently irrelevant, which is the work that John Snow did in analyzing cholera. This map, you may have seen it if you read things like Tufte, shows the locations of deaths during an 1854 cholera epidemic in London. And what I find interesting about this is it precedes the existence of a public health department. It precedes Pasteur's bacteria theory of, or the germ theory of disease transmission. And John Snow is a physician. He did some very important work in anesthesiology. And Henry Whitehead was a priest, and both of them lived near the outbreak of this epidemic. And they got a whole bunch of data about who was dying, where they were dying, and they were trying to analyze it in the face of this very important, people were dying, no one knew why they were dying, and people were very concerned. They were fleeing London. They didn't know what to do. Snow's investigation led to the removal of a handle of a pump, which helped bring the epidemic to an end. And I'd like to compare that to the way we investigate security, where we have a real lack of public information. We have these walled gardens of data. We have the ISACs, we have the CERTs, we have the FIRSTs, we have the CSI FBI surveys, and all of these are anonymous. All of these are, you get averages, you don't get details, and these are very, very hard to use if you'd actually like to use them to, say, drive a budget, make security decisions. Bruce's question of, well, this one is 100 gigabits or a gigabit per second, this one's 100 megabits, but this one's more secure. We don't have that sort of data. And we don't have that data because we don't like to share the data that we have. Some of us collect data inside organizations. Some of us know what's happening, but we don't talk about it because of liability concerns, because of embarrassment concerns, because we're worried that customers would flee. We're worried that we'd lose our. And I have this quote from Dan Geer, that no CSO on Wall Street has the authority to share firewall logs because no general counsel can see the point. You can't look at the firewall logs and see what commonalities are happening and know where the data is coming from, even inside some of these walled gardens. And I believe that breach disclosure is changing everything, that we are seeing a tremendously important shift in the way we're able to talk about problems, in our ability to gather data, and our ability to use that data to make decisions in the future. And so I'd like to thank ChoicePoint. Those of you who know me or have seen some of my writing know that I often kick ChoicePoint. And ChoicePoint was one of the first companies that was impacted by a new law in California, the Senate Bill 1386. And they made some claims about what had happened that didn't quite line up. And 38 attorneys general were sort of skeptical. They said, really, this breach only affected people in California. We'd love to know if this affected our citizens. And there was a huge media firestorm. It drew attention to some privacy issues. It drew attention to this new law that had come into force a month before. And so none of that actually backs up my thesis. We predicted liability, and ChoicePoint got a $15 million fine. We predicted embarrassment, and there's the blog archive. You can go look at me kicking them. We predicted customers would flee, and ChoicePoint actually fired about 20,000 customers. The numbers are media estimates. They're not something the company will give numbers for. And we predicted their jobs, and ChoicePoint's chief security officer, Rich Bache, is now at PricewaterhouseCoopers, not ChoicePoint. So where's the good for you? What am I up here saying? And what I'm saying is that ChoicePoint is an outlier. They're weird. There have been 560 incidents which the fine folks over at Attrition are cataloging. You go to that list, they have a CSV file. In early March, as I was writing these slides, Bruce, they had about 560 incidents. They have more in there now. There's things added almost every day. And when we actually look at the data, what we discover is that most of them have not shown firings. Most of them do not show substantial numbers of customers fleeing. So how do we know that? We know that because Alessandro Acquisiti, Alan Friedman, and Rahul Talang, Alessandro and Rahul are at CMU and Alan's at school at Harvard, have done some research into what is the actual stock price impact of one of these announcements. And they used data from Attrition, they used data from some other places, and they looked at the stock market impact. And they said, 2 days, a couple of %, and then companies recover. Now there's competing data out there. The Ponemon Institute, in a study that's sponsored by PGP and Vontu, says it's expensive to notify, that customers flee, they'd like to help you do a better job. I believe the Ponemon Institute may be seeing the worst cases. We don't know because they don't list whose data it is they're looking at. But we can actually do science here. We can construct some hypotheses that customers will flee, and we can measure that. We can construct hypotheses that a breach of this size would result in this sort of loss in your share price, or this sort of cost. And we can actually take some real world data and look at our hypotheses and test them. And that's something that we don't often have the opportunity to do in security organizations. We do some of it in other places, but we don't have a lot of data in security. And we can also analyze methodologies. We can look at one study versus another and say, this study has this data, but when you read their methodology section, they forgot to take this into account. And so you can actually understand why the enormous variations that show up in some of these anonymous surveys, why those variations are showing up. So a question we can ask is, do customers flee? The market doesn't seem to think so. Some of the data in the Ponemon survey suggests that it does. So I've tried another experiment. I went and looked at SEC filings. Well, I tried to look at SEC filings because what I did was I took some systems that were in the attrition database, and I looked and said, can I find an SEC filing that discusses how their customers are fleeing? Because, with Sarbox, we think that investors have a right to know about material events. And if you think your customers are going to start fleeing, that's probably not a lawyer, but I would think that customers fleeing en masse would be a material event that matters, and you should tell your investors. I was unable to find any SEC filing. Maybe I was looking at the wrong words, maybe I was missing a database, but I couldn't find anything. I would love to know if anyone has filed an SEC filing that talks about these issues. And I'd like to suggest that if it doesn't matter enough to tell investors, your customers are probably fleeing en masse. Is it embarrassing? Maybe, but you're 1 in 500. Come on. There are a couple of outliers. TJX companies are in the news a lot, the Veterans Administration, ChoicePoint. These are outliers. There are things that make each of these stories interesting. A lot of that is size, but a lot of the small breaches, there's one or even no media attention given to them. And there's something else that's really fascinating as I've been watching these stories now for about 2 years, is we're seeing reports in countries where there are no laws requiring them to tell anyone. There was an announcement in Japan recently from a printing firm that had all sorts of confidential data, and that report, no law mandating it. In the United Kingdom, we've seen reports. The Privacy Commissioner of the United Kingdom has explicitly stated that there is no breach disclosure requirement in UK law. We've seen reports out of the Bahamas. We've also seen reports from places where the law isn't clear. From various parts of Canada. I'll talk more about the state of the law in Canada in just a second. But when you read these news stories, when you see what reporters write, there's often this outraged tone that people are told faster. There's this belief that people have a right to know when their data goes missing. And not only that, they have a right to know quickly. And this is not something that I expected to see happen. It's just something that I'm seeing in the news media, that the expectation is there that the company shouldn't be embarrassed, that they should own up to it quickly and talk about what's happened. So there's the question, do they lose their jobs? I have not seen a lot of reports that cover job loss. I've seen 4 or 5 instances where people have lost their jobs over one of these breaches out of 500 reported. So that's 1%. But it's possible to do better than what has Adam seen. And this is what I love about these new laws, is we can actually go and gather data on this random selection, and we can, someone pick up the phone and start calling the people who have had these incidents and see if the person responsible still works there. See if there's been a change in management. Record the results. You can actually go and do a scientific survey of what the rate of job loss is. So some of the laws. California's 1386 started it. Since then, 34 other states have passed laws. Perkins Coie is a large law firm. They maintain this great chart which lists all of the laws in the United States that they're aware of. The privacy commissioners of Alberta and Ontario and Canada, and also the Australian Privacy Commissioner, have come out and said that the existing laws contain duties of notification in various ways, which I find fascinating because as a non-lawyer, again, I look at the text of the laws, I see nothing about notification, but these folks are experts and they believe that the duties are in fact there. There are efforts underway to create a single national standard here in the United States. And so I believe that breach disclosure is good for you because it allows us to overcome fears. It mandates discussion of some aspects of some security issues. I think discussion is good. I think open conversation about what's happening, a lot to learn from one another. It's why we're here. It allows us to bring this stuff into the open and maybe do better than we have done in the past. It may enable research into exactly what's happening and why. And the provinces of Ontario and British Columbia have some really fascinating questions in their forms. And this is going to be a little bit small, but the questions, this is actually in their PDF. It says, describe the breach. Describe what happened. Describe the information that leaked. And then there are two other questions. One is, what are the steps that have been taken so far to control or reduce the harm? And then, what are the future steps planned to prevent further breaches? Now, these are going to government agencies, and the answers to these questions might actually be subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. I hope they are, and I hope that in the future we'll be able to go and look at these and see what companies are actually putting in place to control future breaches. And when we get some history with this, when we get some time, then we'll be able to say, these companies implemented measure A and those companies implemented measure B. Is there a statistically interesting difference in the number of future reports? We can compare the effectiveness of measures at the granularity and level that people are talking about them in these forms. And that's not something that we have the ability to do today. It's something that we'd love to be able to do, but no one wants to talk about it. So one myth, Rich Bajik is around here, and I'm mispronouncing your name, I'm sorry. He's done some digging to try and find out, are 80% of security incidents caused by insiders? Different people say they are, other people say that's changed with the internet, and the truth is, we don't really have good data about it. We don't have something that I can go and validate a methodology. I can look at the FBI report and see what they said, but it doesn't talk a lot about how the data was generated. Last Chris Erickson and Philip Howard at the University of Washington published a paper, and they took the attrition data set, they did some additional digging to find more incidents, and they discovered that 60% of the incidents that they found involved some form of organizational mismanagement. Now, that's not the same as insiders, but it is a statistical analysis of a large number of breaches. Gives us the opportunity, someone could go back, could look at the news stories and say, is the word insider mentioned, or is there strong indication in what we know about the issue that this was actually an insider? And so we have the opportunity to, instead of arguing about what's happening, we can measure what's happening. So who's right here? I don't actually care. I do care. I care very deeply about who's right. But for purposes of this, don't. And the reason that I don't is because I'd like to really draw attention to the fact that we have a source of data, and my caring is completely irrelevant. I can care very deeply, passionately about what fraction of breaches should be caused by insiders, but we can actually go and measure it. We can go and look and see, of the things that are publicized, how many are caused by insiders, how many are caused by hackers, how many are caused by lost laptops, and we can get away from the arguments and the disagreements about, well, I think this number is better. So there's one last bit of data I'd like to share with you, which is the question of how many moose are at Shmoocon. And I've never observed any moose here at Shmoocon. We're right near the National Zoo, and I believe that they have a whole bunch of moose. And so I'm just wondering, have less moose than zero moose. So I'm going to argue that the tagline for the conference here is incorrect, and I have data to back me up. So there you have it. Security breaches are good for you. Questions? Arguments?
We do have a Q&A mic now, so the question's going to go to you, but anybody else have a question?
I just have a comment about your optimism about knowing what's going on. I think TJX proves that there is no valuable data at TJX right now for us to base our analysis on. They don't know what's going on to this day. They don't know what happened still. So what does that do to our hopes of learning?
So what does TJX actually mean? There actually were arrests made in Florida yesterday. So while we don't have great data out of TJX, the fact that we can have a problem and have no idea what's going on, I believe is interesting in and of itself. Do they have any IPSs? Someone could go and look for TJ Maxx in the customer lists of IPS and IDS vendors. Maybe we'd learn something interesting. I have no idea. But we can study it and we can try and learn from it. There's a question. Go ahead with your question, I'll repeat it.
We've got a mic.
Okay, right up there, please.
Well, except for I was going to ask a question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry.
Well, actually, it was a postulate, which is, I'm Shava, by the way, from Tor, so hi.
Hi.
But I listened to you saying things about, customers fleeing, not affecting things, and I work PR for Tor, and I have the shameful being marketing VP for .com. And let me tell you what probably is being said inside the organization. They're saying bad customers fleeing is a consolidation of a strong core market.
That's,
Yes, that's unanswerable. But
is.
it's probably what's being said, and that's why it's not affecting anything, is because people will hear that and they'll, oh, okay.
Thank you for the comment.
What I was going to say was that you have to look at who someone like TJX is answering to and what the driving force is behind the investigation that's going on. And right now, that's the payment card industry, which is private. One of the big guys in there is Visa. And they don't have to make that information public unless they're asked to by the government.
Well, that's very...
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
But as far as who knowing what and how much is known, they're only going to tell as much as they're asked to tell. And the scope of how much has been exposed in TJX it's not public information. It's not going to be for a while, if it ever does come to public information. But there's lots of small breaches all over the world that constantly happen if you look at the PCI industry, and in total could be bigger than whatever you see at TJX, but it's pretty big.
So it's a great comment, and I love using the analysis of motivations to figure out what's going on. I will note that TJX is answering to two sets of masters. One of them is its shareholders, and the other is the PCI industry. And when you say no one's asking them, well, we've got 34 state laws, plus they have substantial operations in Canada, and there the government is asking questions, and they are saying you have to tell people about this. If you think back 3 years, there may have been similar incidents that we simply don't know about because there was no duty of notification.
Right. One of the things that you can tell is, at least with the payment card industry, if you've ever shopped at TJ Maxx or Marshall's or anything like that, when they have a big exposure like this and your credit card has been deemed compromised, you may get a new credit card in the mail eventually, and that's direct to the consumer. You can't quantify that from outside unless people report it. But if anybody here has gotten a credit card reissued in the last several months, and you're a shopper at TJ Maxx, then you
But we
know what
finally
happened.
know why that's happening.
Yeah.
So I think were there questions over on this side? No? Any other questions? Yes, there's one back there.
Is there ever been a documented case where a stolen laptop, the data on it has actually turned up in public?
Is there a case where the data on a stolen laptop has turned up in public? I don't believe there is. One of the really interesting things about the market for card information and full socials and the rest of it, as I understand it, is that the people selling the data don't say a darned thing about where it comes from, and the people buying it don't ask. So even though there's a lot of reports from people who go and monitor these channels, there's nothing at all, and I've gone and talked to many of the people writing these reports and said, where's the data coming from? And they said nobody in the market discusses where the data is coming from. So we don't yet have that connection to a criminal misuse of the data, but I think it's important to consider not only the criminal misuse, but also the broader privacy implications of this data, the personal dignity, the loss of control over your information, and other things when looking at these. Even if there isn't a criminal tie, I think these laws are important. Paul.
Anecdotal statements, I have no idea if they're true. I wonder if you've heard these or if you have any comment about it, that some of these lost laptop incidents are actually apparently you may have liability or just public image issues if you lose your data by maybe some other means. But if all of a sudden you lost a laptop, that's something that people know how to manage. And so these laptops are suddenly lost in the event of a disclosure.
So the question is, are people spinning this stuff? And
Purpose after a breach by another means
Are
to
pe-
cover their
I-
ass.
excuse me. I would be surprised to see. The question is, are they losing laptops on purpose after another issue? I would be surprised to discover that, because that would be deceitful. And when you have a whole when you have a whole bunch of lawyers in the room analyzing your plans, if your plan starts, let's deceive the public as we try and obey this law, that doesn't seem to me to be the wisest thing. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so who knows what would come up. Yes?
I just wanted to comment about Visa PCI. One of the things that I really like about Visa PCI is that there's a material cost to businesses in a breach. The cardholder companies... I was being loud. Thanks. So the cardholder companies reserve the right to charge a reissuance fee to the organization that loses those credit cards, which is rumored to be as much as $200. So if you're the CFO of an organization, I mean, I'm not a CXO. I don't claim to be able to do that job. But to me, it makes pretty simple math sense if a potential breach could be millions of credit cards and a potential cost could be $200 per card. That's a significant motivator to want to change your organization's practices to security beyond any potential damage that could be done to the brand and customers fleeing and that kind of stuff.
Yes, again, economic arguments are great, and if PCI is imposing charges, I haven't heard a number nearly as high as 200. The highest number I think I've seen is about 25, but I haven't been personally involved in these. These are news media numbers, and we all know how great some of those can be. So yeah, economic drivers for making people do better are a good thing. I'm in favor of them.
Can I actually make a comment on that?
Sure.
Hey, sorry. So it's 20 minutes, so I get to at least pretend that I have some right to be up here. I was involved. How many people in this room were involved in the failed startup previously known as Fort Knox? There's a handful of people. All right. So there are a handful of Shmoo bodies on the side of the road. We tried to do credit card processing and transaction processing on the internet, and we were believers in the secure electronic transaction standard from Visa and MasterCard set.
You can't say anything more.
Well, yeah, exactly. All done. But what was interesting was that there's no business model. As much as there's economic loss, the people that need new cards and need the new technology are the issuers, and the merchants just keep getting screwed because the technology stays the same. So even though there's economics involved, it's the wrong folks.
Yep. So how am I actually doing on time?
You got like 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. Do we have another? Yes.
I know of several breaches unreported, and the bank or the company has just covered it up and never reported it. And this, has to do with customers in California where they are required by law to disclose it. Is there any sort of data on companies that did suffer breaches but did not report, and this was later found out?
Is there data on companies that have suffered breaches and not told anyone? That's a really hard thing to actually gather data on because it's invisible. And I would love to have data, and actually Ed Moyle, who blogs at Security Curve, has done some really interesting back-of-the-envelope numbers and said, gosh, if you look at how many laptops go missing every year, and that's a well-known number that you can get from all sorts of analysts and laptop companies, and how much data is on these laptops versus how much is being reported and how much encryption software is out there, the numbers don't really seem to line up. But I hate saying that after I've given you a talk on we should get numbers. So it's a good question. It's a hard question. I wish we had a way to answer it effectively and reliably.
Yeah, I think it's time for a round of applause. Any closing comments you want to make? Thanks, man. I appreciate it. All right. So next on the chopping block, it's going to be Johnny. There's Johnny. All right. So